I would like to thank you, and also Shahid, who is in the room, who first contacted me and asked me to be here this morning. And since there is not much I can refuse to Shahid, I had no choice but be here. Shadrach, yourself, Swaibu, Bertild, and Professor Ramutsindela, I think you have already powerfully framed the key questions. So I will not be speaking directly to the issue of heritage as such. It seems to me that the concept of heritage, of course, it is not uncontroversial, but it is somewhat easier to problematize than that of that of modernism or modernity. It is a bit easier to problematize if only we agree that, and this seems to me really important, that heritage is not a property. Heritage is not the customary. If we agree that not all heritage is tangible, that in fact, in our own historical trajectories in Africa, most of it was not at all tangible. And the little we had that was tangible, we have lost it. We have lost it in that kind of loss that is so radical that it is irreparable. It cannot be repaired. One example of such a loss has to do, for instance, with our art objects, or what came later on to be taken as art objects, most of which, as we know, are now housed in various museums in the Western world. Of course, these could be subjected to a process of restitution, and these debates are going on as we speak, and they are extremely important debates. But it is not clear that even if we were to recover the totality of what is housed in museums in the West, it is not clear whether such a repatriation would, if you want, compensate for all that was lost in terms of the knowledge that was embedded in most of those objects, in terms of the savoir-faire, infrastructures of various kinds that made the production of such objects possible, and even more so in terms of the various meanings and significations that were attached to such objects. So this question of loss and of restitution and of reparation seems to me to be absolutely key when, in our case, we speak about heritage. So heritage, not all of it is tangible. It seems to me that properly understood, heritage can be defined as that which is priceless. When I say that which is priceless, what I mean is that which cannot be measured, at least not along quantitative criteria, financial or otherwise. What I mean is that which is, in other words, incalculable, because it is always in excess. And it is in excess because fundamentally heritage is a life force. And because it is incalculable and immeasurable, it allows us to open up the possibility of a different aesthetics, of a different politics, a politics of inhabiting the earth, of repairing and sharing life. That's how I would define heritage, at least seen from our own historical trajectory, that of societies that have lost a lot, the kind of loss that is to some extent irreparable. Now, the other concept, modernism, modernity, that other concept is a bit more complicated. If we want to read it from the point of view of our many histories, because Africa doesn't have one history, we have many histories, we have undergone a whole variety of historical trajectories. Now, of course, like many other terms or concepts or notions, this one we borrow from elsewhere. Now, it's a concept that is difficult to define in our context, but so it is where it comes from. Because even in Europe itself, there remain disagreements about the boundaries of the modern and its meanings. Let me just say that in Europe, modernism signaled many things, but more importantly, it signaled a particular attitude towards the present and a conscious departure from the past. That rupture it didn't just happen by accident. The rupture was consciously constructed. It was deliberately constructed. I don't think this has ever been the case in Africa. The conscious construction of a rupture with the whole of the past. Of course, during anti-colonial struggles, we imagined various ways in which we could build such a rupture, but a rupture with the colonial past, which was not equivalent to a wholesale rupture with all of our past. In fact, a huge part of our history has often forced us to keep relying on our past as a resource for sustenance in a present that was extremely hard. When one looks, for instance, at, let's say, African independent churches within the Christian tradition, on the one hand, these are churches that espoused the gospel coming from outside, and to a large extent, they embraced the habitus that was attached to these modalities of Christian faith that came from outside. And yet, what they tried to do, these churches, African independent churches, was to graft to these forms of Christianity coming from outside important elements taken from our own past. And therefore, they ended up creating syncretic formations, faith formations, that were hybrid, both in terms of their content, the content of the faith, and in terms of the forms of the faith. Is it what we mean by modernism? I'm not sure. If indeed we take seriously the fact that modernism in its context of origin signaled a particular attitude toward the present, which involved a conscious departure from the past. From a cultural historical point of view, it doesn't seem to me that that is the approach most parts of the continent followed. Now, if we take modernity as defined by scholars today, it engages a whole set of things, whole set of social changes, in fact, which imply, for instance, urbanization, industrialization, wage labor, factory systems, and so forth and so on. In any case, the becoming individual of subjects, human people who previously were understood to belong primarily to a community. So modernity implies indeed that antagonism, or that element of conflict between the individual and the community. The individual freeing himself or herself gradually from the shackles of the community and becoming a subject in his or her own right. Now, when we look at our own historical context, of course, I mean, in some parts of the continent, we are familiar with the experience of city life. And this even before colonialism. In West Africa, for instance, we are familiar with the fact of the urban in pre-colonial times. We are also familiar with its colonial instantiations and its post-colonial instantiation, contemporary urbanization, which has not much to do with the historical process of urbanization in Europe, in the sense that the urbanization that leads to modernity was, to a huge extent, undergirded by capitalism, by the capitalist economy. Now, it was not only, let's say, buttressed by the capitalist economy, it was unleashed by the Industrial Revolution, the cities that emerged out of the Industrial Revolution. But here in our continent, with the exception of South Africa in the late 19th century, no other part of the continent has truly gone through a process of industrial revolution. Our cities, Lagos, Abidjan, Dakar, Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, Luanda, Kinshasa, are not the products of the Industrial Revolution. They are the product of other types of processes definitely connected to the expansion of capitalism, but not in its industrial form. And as I'm saying, in Europe, modernity or modernism is, to a huge extent, part of that broad historical process, capitalism in its industrial form, and nowadays, of course, financial algorithmic forms. I could go on and on in terms of wage labor. Here again, really not the dominant, let's say, economic, socio-economic fabric, not at all. So very clearly, we are dealing here with a different historical trajectory, different realities. We should legitimately call for a different name. And this has been at the heart, in fact, of most debates on modernity, modernism, and so forth and so on, for a very long time. Shadrach mentioned post-colonial theory, decolonial theory, and so forth and so on, the likes of Edward Said, before him, many others, after him, of course, a lot. There have been an attempt at accounting for these forms of, let me just call them worldliness, which emerge out of different historical contexts, most of which have come at some point or the other to be entangled in each other, producing therefore effects and new realities that are not exclusively European, that have an element of Europe in them, but also more than just Europe. So many have been talking about alternative modernities. It's a term that has been pushed forward in particular by Indian scholars, by the way, Dilip Gonkar and a number of others. Many others have proposed the term of plural modernities. But this has not, in fact, put an end to the controversy. The controversy is still going on. It is going on because clearly we need a different name for these processes. Now, in so far as modernism as such is concerned, broadly speaking, it designates artistic practices associated with modernity, of course. But modern art practice, whether in European or other contexts, also signals a sense, I would argue, of continual difference, a self-conscious process of refashioning the self. And as I said early on, the projection of particular attitudes towards the past and the present. But let me comment briefly on this issue of self-refashioning, because this is African, if I can speak in such broad terms. The idea of refashioning the self, we find it at the heart of, let's say, African pre-colonial systems of thought. In particular in West Africa, Central Africa, probably too in Eastern Southern Africa. The theory according to which identity, or what we call identity is fundamentally about two things. It's about relation, which is not exactly the same as in the kernel of Western philosophy, where identity is about ontological questions. The question of being is at the heart of Western philosophy, from the Greeks until so and so. When you look at what is told to us in African cosmogonies, identity is about relation, and identity is about becoming. It's about open-endedness to that which is not yet there. And you read, for instance, the novel written in the 50s by the Nigerian author Amos Tutuola. I think Amos Tutuola is one who captures this metaphysics in the most dynamic and powerful way, and shows to what extent identity is about movement, it's about motion, it's about openness, it's about the capacity to become somebody else. If this is not self-refashioning, what else is it? And in fact, if we really want to append the concept of the modern to Africa, this is the hook. It is indeed through this hook that let's say, we can redeem that concept in our context. So those are some of the comments I wanted to make insofar as the concept itself is concerned. Now, when we look at the literature, of course, we find a lot written on so-called African modernism. Then the question we might want to ask is, what do we understand by that? What is African in African modernity or modernism? How does what is called African modernity, how does it operate in global contexts? Since ours is a global continent, it has always been. And how can it be, if you want, theorized? I raise these issues because they are at the heart of at least scholarly debates on this topic. You take someone like Valentin Mudimbe, the very important, probably one of our best philosophers, who teaches in America. He wrote a book in 1998 called The Invention of Africa, where, among many things, he shows that Africa is a complex intellectual construct. I mean, he doesn't define Africa the way the German philosopher Hegel, for instance, defined it. But for him, it's fundamentally a complex construct. It is partly, according to Mudimbe, an invention, and partly the affirmation of certain historical features, cultural characteristics, but also values which contribute to turning Africa into a civilization that is different from those, say, of Asia, Europe, and so forth and so on. A diverse and highly complex historical entity. I keep insisting on that element of highly complex and of historical, because for those who are familiar with these debates, when the question of modernism, modernity, the modern, is raised for the first time in relation to the continent, it is precisely to deny the continent that element of complexity and that element of historicity. So we might wonder then, how is it that we take this concept of the modern, which was used precisely to turn the continent into something inert, something unchangeable, the epitome of difference and tradition, but tradition understood as custom, the customary, that which never changes, that which is always the same, that which lacks historicity. How can we recover that concept and apply it now to that of heritage, which, as I said early on, signifies precisely life forces, that which cannot be contained, that which is immeasurable and priceless. Is a total contradiction, one would argue, to speak in terms of the African modern, and even more so of the African modern heritage. But look, I mean, these days we borrow Conceptualisation, international organizations create a lexicon, and things get mixed up. If we want to look into them from a purely scholarly point of view, these are the kinds of contradictions we end up unearthing. So I could go on and on, highlighting those aporias. I'm not sure that this will be very helpful for you or for anybody else. But let's just be conscious when we use terms like this of the what they might open up in the end. Now, the question is, since the term is being used, African modern heritage, what can it possibly mean? Can we supplement it? Can we translate it in a way such that it highlights the life potentials, the life forces, the concept of heritage has meant in the continent? How would we do it? I think we can do it, first of all, once again, by recognizing the highly complex and historical nature of the continent, by taking seriously the fact that several trajectories have contributed to the making of its patrimony, of its heritage. I could mention a number: colonial primitivism, the what came in the context before colonialism, what came after, if one is to adopt such a rather linear historical, let's see, chronology. The plurality of trajectories, in the sense that these colonial trajectories were extensively shaped, of course, by the colonial experience of at times, but in turn they created parallel internalized divisions, as well as moments of connections, international links, and overlaps. Overlaps in the sense that divisions such as North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, such divisions have never really been entirely preeminent. Several trajectories, in the sense that there has always been a diasporic element, a diasporic dimension constitutive of the making of African heritage. And when I mention diasporas, I do not simply refer to African diasporas in the New World or in Europe. One is also thinking about internal diasporas, including all those who came from outside, which make it such that it is impossible, if you want, to speak of Africa as only inhabited by Black people. Several trajectories also, in the sense that a lot of the heritage has been constructed by people who spent most of their time in exile, people who led an itinerant life, which is exactly the case in the visual arts. For instance, think of people like Skunda Bogosian, Dumile Feni, Mankoba, Sikoto, Ibrahim El Salahi, Malangatana Ngwenya, many names. Fact that too, these is in a case a generation of artists comparable to the generation of African literary figures, most of whom ushered a new era of so-called modern African literature from a position of displacement or itinerancy or exile, in the process by which they looked for new tropes of self-representation and self-expression. But let me end these comments, because it's not really a lecture, it's a set of comments to help us to make sense of not only the past, but really our future. That's how I understand this thematic of heritage in any case. I mentioned loss, but heritage has fundamentally to do with the creation of new forms. It's not about the conservation of old forms. It is about the creation of new forms of the real, mobile forms, forms that can move. It's not about returning to some primal scene at all costs. It's not about reiterating the gestures of the past in the present. It's about creating new forms of life for the future. That's how the concept of heritage has always been understood in African pre-colonial metaphysics. But heritage has also been understood in African pre-colonial metaphysics as a way of inhabiting the world. So far so that the business of heritage has the real name for heritage, modern or not, has been worldliness, ways of inhabiting one's own time and the world at large. And in the process, learning how to take care of it, that world at large, one's own times, and learning how to repair one's own times and one's own world, if you want. So I'll end with these two motifs of care, of reparation, of repair, if you want. Care and reparation of what? Of that which is immeasurable, of that which is priceless, of, if you want, life forms and life processes. So if we are able to reinterpret the modern in Africa in those terms, translate it into those old languages of ours, then maybe we can reopen a different future for ourselves and for our planet. Thank you very much.